Unas breves palabras al respecto y pues bueno, agradecerle infinitamente la presencia justamente del VP de Twitter, Colin. Muchas gracias por asistir a este panel. Por supuesto, la asistencia también de Diego por parte de Facebook y como moderadora Ana Paula Ordorica. Así que muchas gracias por estar por aquí. Elisa también, en representación de Comexi. Muchas gracias por la convocatoria. Entonces, pues bueno, vamos a iniciar este panel para saber de qué va a ir, cuáles son estos impactos que vamos a tener. Así que les cedo la palabra a Mariano. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carla. Yo realmente solo quiero sumarme a la bienvenida que ya se ha externado. La Universidad Panamericana es la casa de todos ustedes y nos alegra mucho que con el motivo de un panel como este, además de las reflexiones y el interés que en sí mismo suscita, también sea una oportunidad para que nos conozcan, para que nos visiten, para que sepan que como Escuela de Comunicación y como universidad, como casa de estudios, estamos muy interesados en reflexionar en torno a estos temas. Por tanto, también esta es su casa y esperamos que sea, si es la primera vez que nos visita, que sea la primera de otras ocasiones en las que también nos podamos encontrar. Por supuesto, agradecemos la visita de todos ustedes, sobre todo de quienes vienen de más allende, de más allá, un poco lejos para estar con nosotros. Y solamente a manera de encuadre, desde la perspectiva de la Escuela de Comunicación, estaba comentando ahorita con Colin, yo me dedico a las teorías de la comunicación, a la filosofía de la comunicación. Acabo de regresar del Congreso de la Sociedad de Fenomenología y Medios de Comunicación, y buena parte de la reflexión, sí, académica, desde la perspectiva quizá de la filosofía, uno de los grandes asuntos que estamos viendo los académicos que estamos en esta investigación es cómo los medios de comunicación siempre han condicionado nuestra experiencia, las categorías básicas que definen nuestra experiencia, como el tiempo, como el espacio, y en un momento como estamos viviendo ahora de gran efervescencia informativa, de cómo al fin y al cabo la posibilidad que tenemos de asimilarnos a colectivos, ya sean reales, ya sean imaginarios, que nos dan identidad política partidaria, está muy condicionado por el uso de medios de comunicación que hacemos y por las tendencias globales, aunque no nos afiliemos de manera precisa o exacta a todas esas dinámicas globales. Por tanto, es un tema de primera magnitud para nosotros como Escuela de Comunicación y nos parece que por eso es una ocasión de mucha alegría poder tener un espacio, aunque sea breve, para que quizá empecemos una conversación que después se pueda continuar precisamente a través de las redes sociales. Pues de nuevo, muchísimas gracias. También quiero agradecer a la maestra Carla Rojas, directora de los posgrados de comunicación, por haber convocado esta mesa, y pues de nuevo agradecerles a todos ustedes y particularmente a todos nuestros panelistas. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias.
Yo quiero así suele de pronto pasar algunas cosas, vicisitudes. Ok, bueno, pues estamos en este panel de Power Plays, en donde justamente platicaremos sobre las elecciones 2018 con expertos en tema digital marketing, así que pues empezamos este panel y bienvenidos, adelante, abrimos la conversación.
Muchísimas gracias, muy buenas tardes. Soy Ana Paula Ordorica, soy periodista, trabajo en Foro TV y escribo en el periódico El Universal, y le agradezco al Comexi, de quien soy miembro, el haberme invitado a moderar esta mesa el día de hoy. You wanted us to have this in English, Colin?
Spanish.
Spanish, okay. So thank you, Colin Crowell, VP of Public Policy, Government and Corporate Philanthropy for Twitter. Y a Diego Basante, Manager, Latin American Political and Government Outreach de Facebook. Thank you both for being here. I was reading this weekend an article by Niall Ferguson. He just published an excellent book called The Square and the Tower, where he tries to relate what has happened since the age of the Freemasons until the age of connectivity through Facebook and other networks, how we can survive and what effects this has had on our countries, on our societies, on our democracies. And I think it's a very interesting topic, and now that we are going to talk today, power plays understanding elections and social media, well, this came into mind. Is there, some people thought, for example, 2009 was a positive year, showing how networks were going to help countries thrive, democracy thrive, but then we have seen what has happened in the Middle East, and that has not been clear. So I think listening to what you have to say almost 10 years later is quite interesting. I would like Colin to ask you, you can start, I think you have a presentation.
I'm happy to start. I'll mention some of the things you just noted, just by way of beginning. Certainly if you look at communications theory, mass media theory, we're here at a communications school. One of the things that is clear is that historically, leaders of countries, world leaders, controlling authorities of any sort would use the so-called traditional media, which was typically a broadcast medium, and they would use television or radio to send messages to the people, to the citizens of a country. And the arrival of the internet changed the dynamic somewhat, that it created more opportunities for the people to speak back to elected leaders or the world leaders in their particular country. So up and down a vertical, the leaders would speak to the people, and the people could increasingly use the internet to speak back. But the advent of so-called social media and open platforms for participatory communications created a horizontal axis that we saw in quite pronounced ways during the Arab Spring that you referenced, which is the following. There might be somebody on one side of the city who might share something on social media, might tweet something, that somebody on the other side of the city who never met them or knew this person sees because it's public. And they say, oh my goodness, I never realized somebody felt the same way that I do about that. And if you multiply that by lots of people, and people, while they could speak back using the internet to world leaders, it wasn't often seen publicly what they were sharing and speaking back about. And so that phenomenon of sharing perspectives, sharing opinions on that horizontal axis meant that people on one side of a city or on one side of a country could share something that people on the other side could see, and together they could organize and certainly engage in important civic conversations. This is something that, while if you went through the relevant countries in the Middle East that you referenced, and where they turned out on the spectrum of democratic institutions and norms at this point, I think you'd see gradations of success and lack of success. But we do see this on Twitter all the time. So, for instance, even in the United States over the last several weeks, what you saw was, after a tragedy in Florida of a school shooting, you saw students take to Twitter and share their perspectives, frankly, about their disappointment in adults, disappointment in politicians. And that has provoked a national conversation in ways that we've never really seen before. Arguably, if this was localized to a particular jurisdiction, or just the local TV stations, the local newspapers, and never really made it national in a sustained way, where the students themselves are driving the news cycle. That's something that could pay dividends, and could, that kind of activism could result in progress and moving society forward. And that's an important part of what we see. These are things that also have not insignificant implications for elections when we see that. So one of the things that I did want to do drill it down a little bit to a Mexican context is share some data that we're sharing today based upon a survey of Twitter users here in Mexico that illuminates some of the things that Twitter users in Mexico are hoping to see from the parties and the candidates in this election cycle. So I'll just read some of the top line data from this. First, not surprisingly, people on Twitter have a high interest in the election. And so some 94% of our users indicate that the presidential elections are important to them. The interest can also translates into their likelihood to vote, which is quite promising. So the majority of people on Twitter are likely to vote in the election. 86% of those asked indicated that they were likely to vote. They do indicate that one of the things that we consider a particular strength of Twitter's is that it is wildly public and fast, and it is a place where breaking news will happen. We are also cognizant of the fact that there are tons and tons of journalists on Twitter. And so that combination of breaking news, interest in the election, most of the major parties and candidates actively participating in the conversation, and of course the journalists covering it will make this a particularly dynamic civic conversation on Twitter as we get closer to July 1st. 7 out of 10 people stated that Twitter was where they were hoping to get information about being informed about the election, and citing the real-time information flow as one of the main reasons. But interestingly, only 45% of people on Twitter have decided on a candidate thus far. 32% are undecided, and 23% are open to persuasion. So the majority of the Twitter users surveyed indicated that the election is still up for grabs, and that is, I think, a significant signal to the political parties. And 1 in 3 users has not defined who they'll vote for. Among first-time voters, 7 out of 10 are undecided, which is also interesting when we think of the youth vote. 7 out of 10 are undecided. The topics, regardless of party or perspective, that people are most interested in, the topic that interests most people on Twitter is corruption at 46%, followed by economic growth at 27%. But the distribution of how people feel about it differs by age, which is interesting. For first-time voters aged 18 to 25, economic growth is their main issue of interest. Among undecided voters, both corruption and the economy weigh equally as important topics. The other thing which I think is notable is that 8 out of 10 people surveyed on Twitter indicated that they have a negative view of candidates or parties that engage in negative campaigning. And so this is not surprising when you ask them, do you like negative ads or negative campaigns? Most people will respond that way, but it's certainly reflected at a very high rate amongst Twitter users. So I'll pause there, but I thought that was interesting information to share about a particular Mexican context for the discussion.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, I forgot to say this, that we used to have this belief that we are 6 persons away from everybody on Earth, and what they say is that, well, this is Ferguson's theory again, is that connectivity through Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, all of that has made it 3.75. We're 3.75 and not 6. Diego, I don't know if you want to continue, react to something, or do you want me to ask you about Cambridge Analytica from the start?
I think I'd rather ask what Colin answer what Colin, but we can talk about Cambridge Analytica if that's what you want to. I have no problem doing that.
There's that big elephant over there.
Yeah. So first, let me start by picking up on what Colin was saying about the role of social media nowadays. So I certainly agree with the fact that we are now living in a different environment where Communication cannot be, you know, a one-way street where politicians teams simply put out a message and expect that message to be consumed by the larger public, right? So there's definitely a horizontal axis now to communication, but I want to kind of like try to land this concept very well because we've seen it really play out on Facebook. So what this means really is that the narrative around the government, the narrative around the politician is more and more a collective construct, right? So in other words, politicians are no longer what they say they are. Politicians are what people say they are. So the title of this conference, this meeting that we're having today, is Power Plays, right? So I think one of the relevant questions here would be to ask, well, where is this power in the age of social media, right? And I would argue that we are seeing a shift of power towards the people, because that's what social media has done and what Facebook has done, definitely. It's shifted power over the people. That's why dictatorships are so afraid of social media. That's why they don't want people to interact with each other, because they know that this means a democratization of the societies in which we live in, right? So basically, perception is reality, and the way we build perception is through the contacts that we have with other people engaging on social media. We are not only receiving the message from the top, from the government, from the authorities, from the people that used to hold power back in the day, but now we are building the narrative as a society, right? In this new environment that we live in, I believe that Facebook plays a fundamental role, and here's why. Because on Facebook, unlike any other platform that you can find, each one of us interacts with our colleagues, with our family members, with our co-workers, with the people that are part of our real life, from our real social networks, right? And that means that the place that we hold in these networks is a place of influence and, frankly, a place of power. Let me give you a very concrete example here. So, for instance, for my job, I have to sit down very often with political parties that are trying to get their candidate elected, right? And one of the things I tell them is, well, listen, you can spend all the money in the world. You can, you know, be day and night, you know, hammering down with your political propaganda and have millions of dollars for ad buying. But at the end of the day, myself, you know, without spending one single cent, one single peso, I have way more power and more influence over the vote of my wife, my co-workers, and my friends than the political campaign that is trying to get those votes. And why do I have that power? Well, simply because of the position that I hold within that social network, right? Because my position is a position that is trusted by my friends, by my colleagues, by people that are close to me in that social network. So when the message is built on the social networks that are reflected on Facebook or on social media in general, that message has way more power, right? And to kind of like try to localize this a little bit more for the Mexican environment, let me tell you this. We are about to face what will be the biggest electoral process in the history of Mexico. Not only because of the volume of elected positions that are up for grabs, around 3,400 if I'm not mistaken, and the number of candidates, but also because of the sheer volume of people that are on social media and specifically on Facebook. In Mexico, we have 80 million active users every month on our platform. And here's the thing, when I give you this number, when I say that in Mexico there's 80 million people on Facebook, I'm not talking about Facebook accounts. We don't even care how many Facebook accounts there are in Mexico. I'm talking about individuals, people that are actively using their Facebook profiles to read about what's going on, to engage with politicians, and to make their voices heard. So I think that we are about to face an incredible opportunity. We're already seeing big participation in Mexican society through Facebook, and we still have some more weeks to go before the election. I'm sure the numbers will keep going up, and as we go along, we can talk about more about the the measure of civic participation that we've seen on Facebook in other elections too.
Thank you, Diego. I will start asking you, and this question I think applies to both, although answers may vary. You say Facebook gives power and influence to the people with no cost at all. What about privacy? Because maybe you have to be able to participate and to achieve that power and that influence, you are trading that with your privacy. At least 50 million people right now have had their privacy breached through Facebook. And I think that is something that implies a cost. So first I would like to ask you if you feel that there's a cost to privacy. And then this idea that networks were going to make the world a better place. I think the founder of Twitter, one of the founders, Evan Williams, said to the New York Times in May 2017, I thought once everybody could speak freely and exchange information and idea, the world was automatically going to be a better place. And I was wrong about that. He said that. So I want you both to address both things, privacy and if and how social media can actually make this a better interaction in political terms. Yeah.
Okay, sure. First of all, let me address your question about privacy, and you're clearly referring to Cambridge Analytica, which has made the news.
I mean, that's because that's today in the news, but the Russian.
Right, we said 50 million people saw the privacy news. So first of all, let me clarify something right there. This is not a case of privacy breach. This is not a breach of personal data. And to say it was a breach is basically a misrepresentation of what happened. What happened here is that Professor Kogan, he was a developer, and through an app of his, about 4 years ago, he gained access to people's information through Facebook for academic purposes, for research purposes. The people that signed to use this app, they gave their consent to have their information transferred over to Professor Kogan. They were, accepting what was going on, and there was no breach here. Like, no Facebook systems were hacked. There was no hacker operation here. This was not a breach of information. The people gave their information, and they gave their consent for Professor Kogan to do this. The problem
for academic
purposes, exactly, like you said. So the problem is when Professor Kogan betrayed the trust not only of Facebook and Facebook policies, but also of the people that were using the app by sharing that information that was supposed to be used for academic purposes with, SCL and Cambridge Analytica and all of these other actors that were using this information for other purposes that were not according to Facebook policy. Exactly, for political purposes, which were not according to Facebook policy. Now, when we learned about this 2 years ago, we immediately took action and we addressed all the different parties, Christopher Wiley, Cambridge Analytica, SCL, and we asked them to delete the data. And they said that the data was indeed deleted. We are now learning that this may not be the case, so we of course taken action to secure that the data is deleted. But here's the thing, this happened 4 years ago, and from that time to today, we've taken action to make sure that an app like this cannot be developed anymore by developers. So in other words, if Professor Kogan had this app today, he would not be able to use it through Facebook Live. So the problem has already been addressed, right? So that's the first thing about privacy. Then on the second part of your question about can social media, can technology make the world a better place, I think is the spirit of
in political terms.
Right.
If this connectivity and if this giving power to people
right.
is going to be, or you feel is being helpful towards democracy or for democracy.
Okay, so here's my thought on this, and I believe this is Facebook's thought on this as well, of course. Giving power to people is not enough. So making the world more open is not enough. Originally, we thought at Facebook that opening up the world would automatically lead to people being more connected and people learning and understanding each other better. But this is not the case. We found out that opening up the world does not necessarily lead to everyone understanding each other better. Technology is not good or bad per se. We decide what we make of technology, right? So nuclear energy, is it good or is it bad? I mean, you can use nuclear energy to power up a whole city, so that's good, but you can also use it to build an atomic bomb, right? So technology is not necessarily good or bad per se. It's how we use technology. And that's one of the things we're learning with social media, right? Social media gives people the enormous, unprecedented opportunity of connecting to one another, of talking directly to their elected representatives, of addressing their candidates directly, of holding them accountable, of having more participation and civic engagement in our societies. But what we've learned is that there are bad actors out there, and they can use social media for bad purposes. We at Facebook are taking steps to secure that this does not happen by things such as combating false news, by monitoring our platform to make sure that we get rid of bad actors on it, to make app review processes more strict as we go along. And these are just some of the things that we're doing, and we can talk about it in more depth if you'd like.
Okay, thank you, Diana.
Sure.
Colin.
You mentioned the quote from one of our co-founders, and he was reflecting the hope and the aspiration that if you connected everybody and everybody got to converse and engage in conversation, that it would inherently make the world a better place. I think the reality is that oftentimes what happens on public platforms is akin to holding up a mirror to society sometimes. And so when you hold up that mirror, you might not always like what you see that's reflected in the real world. It can be shared and accelerated through the propagation characteristics of a global network in ways that weren't previously available. But in a political context, for example, what you'll often see in almost any society is hyper-partisan rhetoric. And that rhetoric can sometimes be highly charged. That's something that we need to look at. Certainly, we've seen on Twitter issues, thank you, with respect to abuse and harassment. We've seen issues with respect to gender-based harassment that were not things that we wanted to see on the platform. In January of last year, our CEO announced that safety would be our #1 issue as a company-wide. And during the course of 2017, almost everyone at Twitter at some point during the year was working on something related to safety. And during the course of the year, in the last 14 months, we've announced some 25 different changes in policy and product that today means that we action 10 times more accounts for safety-related issues than we did a year ago. And so we do feel like while we're making progress, and we've made some significant progress, that there's still significant ground where we can make additional progress. When you look at a quote like that and you think of some of the things that you might find on social media, including in an election context, I agree. The question is, how do we animate the technology with our human values and the ones that we most want to impart to our own children? How do we animate the platform with the ideals that reinvigorate democracy, that support democratic institutions rather than erode or have a corrosive effect on those? One of the things that we recently launched through a series of tweets from our CEO about 2 weeks ago was an RFP process, a request for proposals, where we acknowledged some of the shortcomings of the platform and the areas we wanted to make progress. But what we tried to do was along those lines of how do we animate the platform with the human values that we cherish. And so what we were doing was asking researchers, academics, think tanks to help us and to proceed as Twitter with a healthy dose of humility around this, to establish criteria around the civic conversation on the platform and try to define criteria that were important. But tech companies like to measure things. And so find some metrics we could associate with that criteria, gather some data around it, and come up with some measurements, but importantly, measure it over time. And see whether the changes that we're making are making things better all across the board, making some things worse, and we can recalibrate. So the 4 criteria, and you can find this, Jack Dorsey, @Jack is the handle. You can go back a couple of weeks and see these tweets. We also put a blog that has a link to the request for proposals. But the 4 criteria that were articulated in partnership with a nonprofit associated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are the following. So the first is shared attention. Are we in agreement generally about what's important to our community, what's important to our country? The second one is shared reality. Are there certain facts that we hold in common to be true? You used to hear this saying that, you could have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts. Well, increasingly, people want to have their own facts, too. So shared reality is about measuring whether there are certain facts that, regardless of your perspective or the way you think policy should develop in your community or your country, do we hold certain facts to be true in common? The third is diversity of perspectives. One of the things that we need to be cognizant of is sort of filter bubbles or reinforcement of biases that we may have, so we might be seeing the same information or reinforcing perspectives rather than getting a diversity of opinion. One of the things that's built into the product of Twitter itself, which is a great piercer of filter bubbles, is the hashtag itself. If you click on a hashtag, it will take you to a page where you can follow that topic, and you'll see tweets from people who you don't follow, and invariably you'll see tweets with content that you don't necessarily agree with. But the question is that intuitive to people to follow topics in that way and gain a diversity of perspectives around it? And the 4th criteria that we'd like to look at is generally about receptivity. If you're exposed to differing opinions, are you receptive to them? Are you open to persuasion? Is the conversation around that civil, or is it toxic? And so what we'd like to do is ask some smart people in think tanks and academia and researchers to help us refine and further define those criteria, to come up with metrics to measure them, to figure out what data would be necessary and how we would gain that data. And so we're asking for these proposals from around the world by mid-April. We've promised to winners some meaningful money to help them do the work, but probably more valuable than any cash we give them is access to Twitter data itself to further their research. We're trying to open up, some of the stuff that is already public in the form of data that we possess, to put it in the hands of researchers so that they can help us figure out the smartest, best ways to recalibrate and refine the product in ways that makes it healthier. We're describing this as a public health framework. So think of the Twitter civic conversation the way you would do a public health assessment. If we go to a doctor will tell us our cholesterol level, whether we have high blood pressure, our heart rate, whatever it is. There are certain metrics associated with our health. What are the metrics associated with the health of a public conversation on Twitter? And we're stipulating up front, we don't know necessarily that we have all the answers here, which is why we're asking the public to help us.
Thank you, Colin. I think this factor where people tend to cluster with like-minded people happens in real life and in social media. So it's maybe the idea that social media was going to allow us to communicate and see other people's point of view or other media point of view or whatever, does not happen because people tend to follow like-minded person and like-minded media. So as you say, it's a mirror. No?
Yeah, it is a mirror. That's certainly the case, probably offline and online at the local level. I think my own, personal experience with it is also shaped by the fact that it's a global platform. So I do follow people who are not necessarily in my local community who are on the platform, who do give me some diverse perspectives from around the world. particularly news organizations and things from around the world that bring in coverage of something that is a little bit different than I might expect back home. And that's often quite informative to me.
But probably you would watch news, world news, if social media didn't exist. Maybe you would watch Channel 4.
Yeah, I might do that, but to have it in the palm of my hand wherever I go is also different. And to not have it necessarily from news organizations, but from individual perspectives, eyewitnesses. One of the great things about, this is less about social media than just the propagation of smartphones around the world, is you can, whether it's on Periscope or Facebook Live, you can bear witness to history, you can bear witness to atrocity, and bring that to the world instantaneously in ways that can create great awareness and hopefully provoke empathy.
You were saying that one of the strengths in Twitter is that it's used by journalists, but it's not only used by journalists. You have Trump, you have politicians. I mean, I know Narendra Modi, India's Prime Minister, has almost the same number of followers last time I checked that Trump has, both in Facebook and in Twitter. But obviously the impact that we see with Twitter, Trump's tweets are incredible, no? I wanted to ask you about that, your opinion. Is it better because there's people that are constantly saying that they are trying to have Trump stop tweeting, and then other people that say it's great because it's a new way of communicating and of being close to people, and I mean, the world has to learn to deal with this and embrace it. So I would ask you both what you feel about this discussion, politicians in social media, in your case, specifically Twitter and Trump.
Right. Well, obviously a lot of politicians are on social media and many of the platforms, and certainly we have lots of elected officials on Twitter and most heads of state on Twitter.
Angela Merkel is not on Twitter.
She is not on Twitter.
I found that interesting the other day.
Yeah, so we're still working on that. Most heads of state are on the platform, and certainly they engage in different ways on the platform. The thing that about President Trump's use of Twitter and what makes it remarkable is that when he tweets, he brings an authentic voice to his tweets. In other words, when he tweets, people believe it's really him. And so he's not using it the way some politicians might use, where he just tweets out a link to a press release. Or the Twitter handle might admittedly be run by the politician's press secretary or social media team. When the president tweets, people believe it's really him. And what would happen, for example, during the campaign against Secretary Clinton was when then candidate Trump tweeted, and if he did a typo or he used poor grammar, the Democrats and many people favoring the Democrats would sort of explode and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe he put that out with typos," or he doesn't appreciate that "your" in English sometimes needs apostrophe R-E. And they would mock his tweet that was full of errors. But his followers and his supporters didn't see it that way. What they saw was, it's Donald Trump, and he's talking directly to me. That's very powerful for a politician, to have that direct feeling of connection to a would-be voter. It's also incredibly powerful with respect to journalists, because journalists believed it was really him as well. And so when he tweeted at 8 in the morning, he tended to drive the news cycle most of the day based upon what he had tweeted. And so that is an effective use of Twitter when you bring an authentic voice to that. Outside of politics, that's something that we advise other Twitter users and major brands to reflect a voice that seems genuine and unique to yourself. And Donald Trump's account certainly fits in that category. But I think in general, I think it's important for constituents to see what their elected leader believes and is thinking. I think that can provide insight, not only for voters, so that they're not getting a sanitized, distilled version of events and the thoughts of the president hours later from the press room, but they're getting something directly from a world leader talking about something that's important to the country and important to the community. And that's something that I think is valuable, even if it means that sometimes he is sharing things that are provocative, that may be controversial, because it allows voters to react in real time to what the president's saying. It also allows other opposition and other elected officials to react to it in real time and provoke a national conversation around it.
Sure. I definitely agree with what you're saying. We've seen a tremendous evolution in the use of social media by politicians and governments. And if you may, please just let me give you an example from my personal life. So I think it must have been in the early days of 2010. I wasn't in Facebook yet. I was a Foreign Service officer working for the Ecuadorian Foreign Service, South Ecuadorian, and I was serving at the Embassy of Ecuador in Washington, D.C. Back in those days, I told my boss, the ambassador, I said, well, listen, Mr. Ambassador, we're organizing all of these cool embassy events, we're doing like the Ecuadorian Film Showcase or Independence Day, whatever, and we're always getting the same people to come to our events. Like it's the, old 4 Ecuadorian ladies that live in DC that always show up for embassy events. We really need to get the word out there and have more people come from different, more diverse areas of Washington and society in general. So why don't we launch an embassy Facebook page? Right? I suggested to him, why don't we have an embassy Facebook page? And he looked at me like, are you nuts? Like, are you completely out of your mind? Right? And what he said to me is like, Diego, I know you're new at the job, but you have to understand that we represent the Ecuadorian government. We are an embassy. We have to be serious. Like, don't come here like pitching teenager apps for the embassy to embark on, right? Eventually, I convinced him to do a trial for 1 month, which ended up being 8 years now. But the question here was that governments in general did not have that mentality just 5, 6, 7 years ago. Like having a Facebook page was seen as something absurd, frankly. Nowadays, 87% of the world's governments are on Facebook, right? So we've definitely come.
Which governments are the other 23%?
You know what? I'd like to know that too. It's like 13%. Yeah, there's a couple that are not on Facebook. My guess is that they're more authoritarian governments in the world, probably. But the data we have is that 87% of the world's governments are on Facebook. So I definitely agree with what Colin said about how important it is for people to know and to see firsthand what their elected leaders are thinking and saying. But you know what? I would take it one step further. I think that it's just as important for leaders to see and to know what their constituents are thinking, right? So that's the value I see in social media for politics. It's not just elected officials informing people of what they're doing and their plans, but it's actually people being able to hold them accountable. There are a bunch of different success stories about politicians that are doing this, and let me just mention one because he's one of the politicians which I believe is one of the best in Latin America in terms of using Facebook to engage with his audience, and it's the mayor of Buenos Aires, right? The mayor of Buenos Aires, Horacio Rodríguez Larreta. If you go look at his Facebook page, you'll see that every 2 to 3 weeks, he does a Facebook Live to answer questions that get sent to him directly from people, right? So there's no intermediation between the elected official and his constituents. He just sits there in front of the laptop screen and he starts getting questions about, what are you going to do with the subway system? When are you going to plant more trees in my neighborhood? When are you going to paint this park, which needs some work done? And all of these different kinds of questions. And it's just amazing to see how in this big city, the mayor can interact directly with his constituents. And by doing so, not only does he inform of his government plans and what he's doing, but he's also able to tap into the public opinion and be able to feel what people are feeling and see what people are thinking. And I really think that's the value of social media, right? It's the value of political participation and political engagement and bridging the gap that there was between elected officials and their constituents.
I want to get to fake news, but before that, this gives me, raises a question, which is the use that the current candidates in Mexico are using of social media, López Obrador, me, and Anaya, basically. Do you like what they're doing? What would you recommend? And I don't know if you're familiar, I would ask you the same for Twitter.
I would answer it just very quickly the same way I answered the question about President Trump, which is, what we do see is that authentic use, that authentic, genuine voice is the one that carries. Politicians, since the times of the Greeks and the Romans, have always wanted to have that direct connection with voters, where voters feel like the politician is hearing them, and that the politician is going to convivir their experience, right, in the aspirations of the community. And so, one of the things that we saw in some of the data from this survey is they really want that the survey respondents on Twitter want the candidates to engage on the issues. And the two top ones, as I mentioned, were corruption and economic growth, right? Job creation and those things. So to the extent to which candidates are engaged and are conveying an authentic, genuine clarity around their proposals to address that, again, amongst young voters, 7 out of 10 are still up for grabs. And so that is a huge opportunity for any candidate in the field right now.
Especially with the difficulty, I know you're going to talk about this tomorrow or the day after at EMIS conferences, but especially in the context of how traditional media has to work during the elections to cover what's happening. Diego?
Right, so what was the question?
AMLO, Anaya, and me.
How
the
can
use
this
of social media, what would you recommend?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, I think that we need to take into account the fact that all of the presidential candidates are on Facebook and they're very active on the platform. So I guess that's a first sign, and it allows us to say that really all of the presidential candidates have acknowledged the fact that their voters are on Facebook, right? So I think there's somewhere around 88 million people registered to vote during the upcoming election in the country on July 1st. 88 million people registered to vote. On Facebook, there's 80 million of them, right? So voters are on Facebook. That's where people are. And I think that candidates have understood this, and they've understood that Facebook is a platform that brings issues closer to people. So Facebook is a platform that brings people closer to the issues that they care about, whether it be sports, politics, movies, whatever. We know for a fact that people do talk about politics on Facebook, and we have the numbers to prove it. Actually, like just the last election in the U.S., 355 million people discussed that election on Facebook. We've measured the volume of political conversation in different countries in Latin America as well. And we know, for instance, that during the last legislative election, back in last October in Argentina, over 10 million people in the country discussed the legislative elections in Argentina. In Ecuador, where I'm from, almost 5 million people discussed the presidential election there last year. We did this last year in Mexico too. We measured the volume of political conversation in 3 Mexican states that held gubernatorial elections, Coahuila, Nayarit, and Estado de Mexico. And we will do the same thing this year to showcase the volume in which people are talking about issues. And I think that's something that all of the political parties have understood, and I believe that they are working more and more to achieve what, Colin was just saying, to be perceived as authentic. One thing that we've learned is that, if you're not a funny guy in real life and you try to come off as funny on Facebook, it's not going to work. Like, you're not going to be able to build a fake personality on Facebook or on social media in general, I believe, because people are going to realize that you're trying too hard, right? So social media in general, Twitter, I believe, certainly Facebook, are platforms through which candidates can communicate in an authentic way, and I think that's the value that we can all find in politics. Really.
Now, to get to fake news, the other day I was reading a tweet that Jim Carrey put up about Facebook, saying that he was going to suspend his Facebook account, and he was selling the stock that he had on Facebook because Facebook had profited from fake news during the 2016 elections, and they weren't doing enough to address the issue. That's for one thing. And then MIT released a study last week where they say that fake news travels 6 times faster through Twitter than any other outlet, no? Fake news, exactly. And it's done by humans, not by bots, mainly. So, taking these two things into account, how can Facebook and Twitter, in this case, address fake news, and how can people be less vulnerable to it? You want to start, Ian?
Sure. I'll go ahead. So let me start off by saying that we're not at all happy with the issue of fake news, right? I guess that's it. False news really are a problem that affects not only the social media platforms and technology companies, but they affect, the candidates. They negatively affect the citizens, people that are seeking to get accurate information. They affect electoral authorities. They affect all different areas of society. So it's a problem that is not exclusive to social media. It's a problem that we all have. Since it's a problem that everyone here has, really, just because we're part of the conversation, we believe that we should tackle the issue in a holistic way. So we don't believe that we have the answers to everything. We don't want to, be in kind of like that arrogant position where we say, okay, this is the solution to fake news, because it's not a problem that's exclusive to Facebook or even social media platforms in general. It's a problem that we need to address as, a collective group, as societies in general. So what Facebook has done is we've started to tackle the issue of fake news on 3 fronts. First of all, we have been working to disrupt the economic incentive related to fake news. So here's the thing. A lot of people believe that there's a political motivation behind fake news, right? In reality, a lot of the motivation behind the bad actors that engage in this kind of activity is not necessarily political, it's financial, right? So what they want to do is they want to attract people to their websites. They want to lure citizens to go and click on their websites and then monetize this traffic for their own financial gain, right? And one of the things they used to do was, try to create a fake URL of a reputable and well-known news outlet, and they would post that link on Facebook. So people would think, oh, well, this is, CNN or, Televisa or any other well-known and reputable news outlet. They would click on it and they would find out that it's not what they thought it was initially. So we've been working to disrupt this economic incentive in the first place. So you cannot fake a URL on Facebook anymore, this kind of thing, right? The second thing we've been doing is we've been...
how do you attack that monetary incentive? You don't, because I remember in the 2016 elections, much of the fake news was generated in Macedonia, where there were companies that recruited young people that for a small salary would make incredible stories that would generate clicks and that would bring traffic to certain pages, and that would bring the money. That's what I understand is you were referring to when it's a monetary incentive and not a political one, no?
Sure.
So how does Facebook address that
Well, we do that in a different number of ways. One is the one I just mentioned, like by not allowing people to post links that are not real, right? So like you will, on Facebook, you won't be able to hide one of these websites behind an authentic CNN.com link, for instance, right? Or any other news outlet for that. And also we've improved our systems, and we're working with AI, artificial intelligence, to listen to and get more signals from our users so that we can down rank all of these posts that are trying to make people click on them so that they can get redirected to another website. So by using AI, but not only AI, really, it's also reports by people. In Mexico, you probably see that you are all able to report posts and tell us it's potentially fake news, right? So when we listen to those signals, we take action and we down rank those posts, so we effectively curb the spread of misinformation.
So instead of having the most clicked article way up when you put, for example, Florida shooting, and somebody puts an outrageous claim about the Florida shooting, which is not real, but since it's outrageous, it starts getting a lot of clicks, it starts going all the way up in the ladder, and when you search for Florida shooting breaking news, you probably would get a fake video, no? That's what I understand was happening before.
Right, but you know, it's good that you mentioned this, because the outrageous headline brings me to the second thing we're doing to combat fake news, which is developing products that effectively fight fake news. So one of these things is like a PSA, a public service announcement, that we're actually running in Mexico today, and it's been running since Saturday, I believe, March 18th. And what it does is, it's a button, you can call it, that shows up on people's newsfeed that tells you how to better identify false news, right? And we've done this not only on the platform, on newsfeed, but if any of you bought today's paper, like on any of the major newspapers, you probably saw an ad that we put out on 10 tips to spot false news, right? And here's why we're doing this, because we think that we really need people's help in combating fake news, because it's not a problem that's exclusive to social media. Here's the thing: we all have you know, these kinds of friends that tend to exaggerate stories, right? We all know this person that maybe goes on vacation to Rome and then comes back and says, "Hey, listen, I got like a personal meeting with the Pope." And we know, come on, man, it's not true. Like, I know who you are, right? And in the real world, we are perfectly equipped to identify these kinds of friends that we have and to identify these kinds of news when they get sent to us. Why are we not equipped equally to identify these kinds of fake news on the virtual world, right? So each one of us, as a responsible internet user, should be equipped with this kind of knowledge. And that's what Facebook is doing. We're telling people, you know, we're giving them these 10 tips so that they can be better equipped to identify fake news. One of them is what you just said, Ana Paula. Look at the headline. Is it scandalous? Is it something outrageous? Look at the source. Is it a source that you know? Is it, you know, a reputable source, or is it some weird website that you've never heard about? Look at the photo. Has it been photoshopped or not? And all of these different signals that will help people better prepare when they get, you know, false information put in front of them. And then the third thing that we're doing is we're working on news literacy. So we have, you know, for instance, the Journalism Project, which is basically trying to be better partners of journalists and the news industry to better understand this problem and to tackle it collectively.
Okay, thank you, Diego.
Sure.
Colin?
Sure. You mentioned the MIT study, and we actually partnered with MIT and provided the data for that study. The thing that came out of that study, which I believe was somewhat overinterpreted in the reporting on it in some ways, was the notion that fake news travels 5 times faster than real accurate news. What the study actually examined and analyzed was a subset of a subset of a subset of a subset of news stories, which was, it only studied fake news stories and true stories that had been fact-checked. So only fact-check stories and stories that had gone viral. So that already means we're dealing with a certain subset. So obviously there are true news stories that fly out of Twitter accounts of news organizations every minute that are traveling at the speed of light around Twitter and travel very fast. We also know that the corrective in many instances can travel quite quickly and importantly can provide a corrective if it comes from a trusted source. But even this study about fact-checked fake stories and fact-checked true stories that we saw the discrepancy in how human beings, not automation, but human beings pushed out the fake news story, tells us something about the human dynamic and the human reaction to things like that. Even when people know the story is not true, they share it, right? And so that's also something, we think it's important information and we learned something from it. We hope it informs further things that can help us analyze this in the milieu in which we're operating. But I'm based in Washington, but I'm originally from Massachusetts. But one of my favorite stories about correcting fake news came after the Boston Marathon bombing. And the Boston Police Department had a Twitter account, and they used the Twitter account to crowdsource evidence. And they put out a tweet and they said, if you were near the finish line of the marathon today, please send us any pictures you have, any photos that you have. Because they were looking for suspects. They were crowdsourcing the evidence gathering, which was an interesting use case in policing and in using that in real time. But at one point over the next day, we were all watching TV and riveted by the ongoing hour-by-hour coverage as they were chasing the Tsarnaev brothers through the suburbs of Boston. But at one point on CNN, the live reporter from downtown Boston announced that the Boston Police Department had a suspect in custody, and that suspect was being driven right now to Boston Federal Courthouse to be arraigned on charges. So all the TV cameras and all the reporters are running to the federal courthouse in Boston. And the person who ran the social media account for the Boston Police Department, ran that Twitter account, saw it on TV and said, checked with her boss and said, do we have a suspect in custody? And said, no, we don't have anybody in custody. People should still stay indoors, right? The city's on lockdown, okay? So within 4 minutes, there was a tweet that the Boston PD put out saying, we have no suspects in custody. Please continue to follow this account for accurate information about, what's happening there. And then, I think it was John King of CNN read the tweet live on TV saying, we now have new and updated information. So, if it's from a trusted source, like the Boston Police Department, from a journalist and others, one of the things that we're learning from these academic inquiries and from the data that we're sharing with some research partners is how we can improve Twitter to make sure that there's an accelerant that is provided to accuracy and truthfulness, that the visibility of journalists is as prominent as it should be to provide that corrective, because ultimately it's journalists and news organizations that hold public officials accountable in any democratic society. And we want to make sure that that is what happens on our platform as well, which again is why we put out this RFP to work with even more think tanks and others to try to improve our understanding in hopes of improving the product.
Well, I don't know if somebody wants to ask either Colin or Diego one question. So, well, thank you, Diego, and thank you, Colin,
Mil gracias.
for coming here, and thanks to Comexico for organizing.
Gracias.